The Dreamer by Pam Muñoz Ryan and Peter Sis. Passion. In Neftali's bedroom in Temuco, giant deafening raindrops blipped and plopped and blooped. Mr. Chukao bird flitted among Neftali's collections of seed pods and cones, calling out his own name. A wave broke against the window, and sea foam seeped inside, dribbling down the sill. Neftali tried to sleep, but each time he tossed and turned, the noises grew louder. Was he so nervous about tomorrow that he could not control his mind? He stared into the room. It did not surprise him to see or hear the sound of the ocean, for he had just returned home from his third summer in Puerto Saavedra. And his old friend, the rain, was an eternal resident in Temuco and in his mind. But could it not grant him one night of peace and quiet, especially given his anxiety? The Chukao, on the other hand, startled him, even though he had been back to the forest many times with father and had heard the bird. He had only seen it that one time when he was 8 years old. Now it was in his room. Was it here to warn him of his fate? Had it called on his right side or on his left? Puzzled, he pulled the blankets over his head and tried to burrow into the mattress. But even though he was 13 now and taller than Rodolfo, he was still painfully skinny and barely made an impression on the bed. Eventually he gave up on sleep, flung the blanket aside, and allowed the raindrops, the Chukao, and the waves their folly. From out of a bookcase he pulled one of his many books and began to read. But the only sentence that appeared on the page was, "What will tomorrow bring?" The next afternoon, Neftali paced back and forth on the walkway in front of Uncle Orlando's newspaper office. He ran one hand through his hair and gripped a notebook in the other. Swiping at the clammy perspiration on his brow, he realized he hadn't felt this nervous since he had stood in front of Blanca and accepted the quinces for his letters over 2 years ago. It did not matter that it was only Uncle Orlando he faced. It still meant eye-to-eye contact with someone who would determine his worth. At least he wasn't facing father, who still told everyone that someday Neftali would be a doctor or a dentist. The more father insisted, the more Neftali knew precisely what he would not be. Before he'd left Puerto Saavedra, he had even discussed his growing anxiety with Augusto, who had said, "There is always a way to do what you truly love." The door swung open. Uncle Orlando poked his head outside. "Neftali! It is you! Why are you walking back and forth in front of my office? Come in!" Neftali blew out a deep breath. As he entered the office, he tried to imagine Uncle Orlando's reaction to what he wanted to ask, and then he tried to imagine father's. Uncle Orlando returned to his desk and sorted papers. Neftali took a deep breath. Uncle Orlando glanced up. "Nephew, you look as if you might faint at any moment. Sit down." Neftali sat. "Why are you so nervous?" I want to ask you something. 2 things. Uncle Orlando leaned forward, his eyes concerned. "Yes?" "Remember when I was younger and you said I could work for you someday?" Uncle Orlando leaned back in his chair and studied him. "How old are you now? Going on 14? Neftali nodded. "Well, you are old enough. It would be a good experience. It would have to be after school, though, and I can pay very little." He smiled. "It does not matter," said Neftali. Uncle Orlando's face turned serious. "There is one stipulation. We must have your father's permission." Neftali's smile disappeared. His shoulders sagged. "I know." Slowly, Uncle Orlando nodded. "Let me think. There will be quite a crowd at the house tonight, yes?" Neftali nodded. Father arrived home from a long trip late last night. Even Rodolfo will be here for a few days. Jose will be in a good mood then. Let me choose an opportune circumstance to ask him if you can work for me. Now, you said you wanted to ask me 2 things. Neftali held out his notebook. It is an essay I wrote for a competition between all the classes in the boys' and girls' schools. They'll publish the winner in the student newspaper. I must turn it in tomorrow, and I was wondering if you could read it first and give me any advice. Uncle Orlando took the notebook. It is the least I can do for a hopeful employee. I'll bring it to you when I come for dinner. I am eager to see Rodolfo. How does he like his new job in Santiago? I am not sure, said Neftali. We don't see him often, and when we do, he does not talk about it much. I miss him. Such is life. He is a grown man now. His uncle tilted his head toward the door. I'm sure your madre and Laurita need help. Off with you, so I can finish my work. Otherwise, I will not have time to read your paper. As he walked home, Neftali tried to imagine an opportune circumstance in which Father would give his permission, but he could not think of a single one. All he could see was an imposing figure in a dark cape blocking his path. That night, drink, talk, and food were plentiful. Neftali watched for Rodolfo, but when he arrived, he formally shook hands with all of the other businessmen and then huddled with them on one side of the room. Wearing their dark suits with their heads nodding up and down, they looked like a crowd of black-winged vultures. At last, Neftali caught Rodolfo's eye. He raised his hand in greeting. His brother nodded in return, but then turned back to the men. When everyone was seated at the table, Father pointed to the only empty chair, the one next to Neftali. Where is Orlando? He sent word that he was detained, said Mamadre. Disappointment squeezed at Neftali. He took tiny sips of his soup. What if our Uncle Orlando had not liked his essay? He picked at his roasted chicken, taking only a few bites. If his uncle had not liked his essay, would he think him worthy of working for him? Would he even attempt to ask Father's permission? By the time the guests pushed back from the meal and Mamadre went to the kitchen for the dessert, Neftali was convinced that Uncle Orlando wasn't coming at all. Finally, he heard a double knock at the door, and a few moments later, Uncle Orlando appeared. Neftali felt relieved, but at the same time, every muscle of his body tightened. Uncle Orlando nodded to everyone. My apologies for my late arrival, but I have been putting the newspaper to bed. Tell us the news, said a shopkeeper, and we will spread it before the paper is in the hands of one person. Everyone laughed. It is the usual, said Uncle Orlando. The weather, marriages, deaths. Another Mapuche man was murdered for refusing to leave his land. To some of you, that is not news because you were involved, even indirectly, with such inhumane actions. But enough of that for now. One bit of news. A new group has formed that will speak on behalf of the Mapuche at town meetings. Ah! Supporting the voice of the oppressed. How quaint, said the shopkeeper. The developers build more businesses, which create more jobs, and you complain about a few Mapuche who are trespassing. On their own land, said Uncle Orlando. That is disputable, said the shopkeeper. Neftali fretted. Would this be the beginning of another argument? Uncle Orlando took a step forward and opened his mouth to speak again, but then he stopped, as if he'd remembered something. He smiled at the shopkeeper. Tonight I am not in the mood to fight, but only for tonight. Instead, with your permission, I would like you all to be privy to an article that will appear in the paper tomorrow. A gentle murmur of expectancy traveled around the table. When all eyes were upon him, Uncle Orlando cleared his throat and began to read. Enthusiasm and perseverance. Neftali's eyes grew wide. Had he heard correctly? That was the title of his essay. His stomach felt as if rocks tumbled inside. He looked around the table as Uncle Orlando read His words about the importance of following dreams and staying determined. He watched everyone's eyes paying rapt attention as they heard about famous explorers who forged ahead into new worlds and conquered obstacles. Uncle Orlando continued with conviction in his voice as he read Naphtali's premise that these voyagers were the heroes of resolve and perseverance. As Uncle Orlando neared the end of the article, his voice became softer and slower. He ended on one somber and thoughtful note. Examples, such as those of Columbus and Marconi, and so many others, should not be discarded because they lead to a more honorable life, and without them, it is impossible to live. There was a pause, in silence. Naphtali hung his head. They must not have liked it. Suddenly, everyone applauded. Naphtali looked from person to person at the appreciation in their eyes. Even Father was clapping and smiling. "Tell us," said one of the guests, "who wrote this?" Naphtali struggled to control his uneven breathing. "A young man who is only 13 years old. Someone I hope will work for me soon." Uncle Orlando swept his arm toward Naphtali. "None other than our own Naphtali Reyes." "Felicitaciones!" exclaimed Larita. "Yes, congratulations," said the shopkeeper. "Quite admirable." Naphtali's hands shook so much that he clasped them together in his lap. How could he feel so proud, yet so filled with fear at the same time? He glanced up and caught Father looking at him with a tight grimace and squinted eyes. Naphtali quickly looked back into his plate. Father cleared his throat and said in a much too cheerful voice, "I am happy you are all so pleased with the entertainment." Naphtali lifted his eyes. Father did not look happy. "Jose," said one of the guests, "I had no idea your son had so much talent." "It is only a hobby," said Father with a quick dismissive tone. "A frivolity, nothing more. Let us talk of something else." "He would make a good assistant for me," said Uncle Orlando. "And he could use a job after school, no? To help save for university?" Father's face reddened with anger. "I will give him an allowance when he goes to the university, if he studies for a reputable job." "But the allowance will not cover all of his expenses," said Rodolfo. "This way Naphtali can buy his own books." Surprised, Naphtali looked across the table at Rodolfo. He had said nothing to him all evening, but was now pleading his case. "It is out of the question," said Father. "Right now, he needs to spend his spare time on his studies that will guarantee entrance to the university." "He earns the best grades in his class," said Rodolfo. Staring at his little brother, he gave a tiny jerk of his head toward Father, as if encouraging Naphtali to say something. "Isn't that right?" Naphtali blurted, "Except for mathematics. But I promised to bring up my score. I would not let my marks in school suffer." He could not believe he'd spoken out to Father. Where had the words come from? Father held up his hand, but before he could say anything, Uncle Orlando said, "University is 3 years away. I can teach him about the printing press, and he can assist me with the business part of running the newspaper. Everyone needs to know about business, right, Rodolfo?" Rodolfo nodded. His voice had lost its energy. He said quietly, "As Father says, there's always a future in business. I know that better than anyone." At that moment, a madre entered and slid a platter in front of Father. It was piled with alfajores, sweet biscuits filled with caramel jam and dusted with sugar. Everyone at the table eyed the dessert and groaned with anticipation. "Jose," said the shopkeeper, "your home is always filled with such interest in delicacies." "It is settled then," said Uncle Orlando. "Please, pass the lovely alfajores." Father grunted and passed the dessert to the guests. The conversation shifted to compliments about the mouth-watering sweets. Uncle Orlando nudged with his elbow. Naphtali did not dare look at him or Father. He did glance up at Rodolfo, who gave him the tiniest of smiles, but it was the saddest smile Neftali had ever seen. The plate of alfajores came his way, and Neftali concentrated on which biscuit to choose. As he ate, he suddenly wished he could amend his essay to include Uncle Orlando and Rodolfo in his list of heroes. Neftali began working for Uncle Orlando the next afternoon. After 2 months, he mastered the printing press. His fingers were stained black with ink, and his apron was soiled from pulling the warm, damp papers off the machine. Its determined song became embedded in his mind. Clickety-clack, foo-ah, clickety-clack, foo-ah, clickety-clack, foo-ah. Neftali heard it even when the press wasn't running, when he sorted the metal type into the printer's drawers, while he ran errands, and even now as he whistled and swept at the end of a long day. He hoped that another of his essays would appear in the paper soon. Uncle Orlando had promised, but he had been so preoccupied the last few weeks that Neftali had not bothered him about it again. Besides, he was worried about his uncle's strange behavior, dashing in and out of the office and never saying where he was going, sending Neftali to deliver letters to one person or another and making him swear not to tell a soul. Meeting people after dark across the street, on the corner, and in the rain instead of in the office. Clickety-clack, woo-ah, clickety-clack, woo-ah. The door swung open, and Uncle Orlando rushed in. He slammed the door behind him and began to shut windows. His forehead was furrowed and his voice tight. Neftali, set up some chairs and put blankets over the windows. Why? Said Neftali. The new group that has become advocates for the Mapuche wants to organize a protest against the developers. They need a place to meet tonight, so I have offered the office. They will be here in a few hours. Maybe the voice of a larger group will do some good. But, Neftali, no one must know about the meeting. Neftali picked up a rag and cleaned his hands. I understand. If the developers find out, said Uncle Orlando, there is no imagining what they might do. They have already killed so many. A thin, winding fear began to worm through Neftali's mind. But how will you know that everyone who comes to the meeting is on your side? Uncle Orlando unfolded a blanket and handed it to Neftali. You will stand at the window and let me know if anyone suspicious comes inside. And if one of the developers sends a spy, he shrugged his shoulders, then that is a chance I must take. After dark, Neftali stood at the window, peeking out from beneath the blanket and keeping a vigilant post. How would he distinguish a developer from a concerned citizen? What would happen if he allowed the wrong person inside? And if he signaled to Uncle Orlando, would there be a confrontation with guns? It was not as difficult as Neftali had imagined. As people crowded inside the small newspaper office, they seemed far more humble than the shopkeepers who had been to his house for dinner. They were not the owners of the shops. They were the clerks. They were not the ranchers. They were the field workers. They were not the politicians. They were the bakers, the seamstresses, and the blacksmiths. Although Neftali looked out during the meeting, he heard everything that went on behind him. Uncle Orlando's sincere voice as he talked about the rights of the Mapuche, the plans for a peaceful protest, the common outcry for respect for all humanity. And when the meeting was over and the people had filed out, Neftali saw their hopeful faces as they clasped Uncle Orlando's hands, thanked him, and said goodbye. After he helped Uncle Orlando put away the chairs, uncover the windows, and lock up the office, they walked together in silence. In his heart, Neftali still felt the energy that had filled the room earlier. Above him, the stars seemed to pulse. Had the heavens felt the uprising of all the good intentions too? When it was time for Uncle Orlando to go in the opposite direction, Neftali asked, "Will the protest work?" "It will work if people are not afraid and if they can find the confidence to do the right thing. But, nephew, it is far more difficult when the time comes to actually speak out. One moment people are strong, the next they are weak. And it is not always their fault. Uncle Orlando turned away. Then, almost as an afterthought, he called back to Neftali. Be safe. Neftali raised his hand in parting. At that moment, he hoped that when the time came, he could be strong, but he was not convinced. It was late when he arrived home. Neftali went to his room. The moon cast a glow upon his rows of sea glass, shells, and insects, now displayed in boxes and crates nailed to the walls. Twigs, nests, and seed pods sat on the dresser in beautiful parades. He opened the bottom drawer, pulled out the stuffed sheep, and retrieved one of the notebooks he kept buried beneath it. In the moonlight, he could see just enough to capture his sentiments on paper. Then he returned the notebook to the drawer, placed its woolly guardian on top of it, and lay down on his bed. The words he had written wiggled off the page and escaped from the drawer. The letters stacked themselves one on top of the other. Their towers reached higher and higher until they stood majestic and tall, surrounding Neftali in a city of promise. Humanity, solidarity, generosity, peace, justice, love. Then a tiny, conceited word came along. Like a hungry termite, it began to gnaw on the tall words, chewing at their foundation, gulping their pulp until they swayed, toppled, and collapsed. All that remained was one fat, satisfied syllable: fear. In the middle of the night, Neftali woke to Laurita shaking him. "Neftali, wake up!" He sat up in bed, stunned and confused. What is it? A man came to the door. The newspaper office is on fire. Neftali threw on his clothes and ran toward the front door, but Father blocked his exit and grabbed his arm. "Neftali, there's nothing that can be done. Go back to bed." Neftali jerked his arm from Father's grasp. He ran to the street to join others already racing to the scene. He looked back and saw Father silhouetted in the doorway. Why wasn't he, too, coming to help? Neftali's heart matched the pounding of his feet as he hurtled down the dirt street. When he turned the corner to the main road, he saw the ball of fire rising into the night. It seemed the entire town was already in front of the building, some people shouting directions to those who were trying to put out the fire, others with their hands over their mouths in disbelief, and those trying to keep people back from the danger. Neftali pushed through the confusion, searching for Uncle Orlando. At last, he found him standing in the street, bewildered, holding a single printer's drawer in his hands. Neftali ran to him. In a daze, Uncle Orlando held up the drawer. "It was all I could save. I ran in, but it was all I could save." A brigade formed, and people passed buckets of water up the line. Still, it was a pitiful attempt to squelch the giant flames. Neftali joined the volunteers, grateful to have something to do with his hands, and at the same time troubled by the futility of it all. As the hours wore on toward morning, the flames died down. The spectators drifted back toward their own homes and businesses. Neftali stayed until all that remained was smoky ash. He stood next to Uncle Orlando in what now looked like the bed of a giant campfire. "Why?" he asked. Uncle Orlando's voice was slow and measured. "The developers think I will give up the cause. They think that the townspeople will now panic and worry about their safety and their jobs. In many cases, that will happen, and support will disappear. And then, the Mapuche will disappear, pushed farther away." Neftali thought about the Mapuche boy he'd met on the riverboat, and how he and his family had gone in one direction, while Neftali and his family had traveled in another. "It is not fair," said Neftali. "It is not right. We should call the authorities." Uncle Orlando seemed eerily calm as he shook his head. "It will do no good. It is their responsibility. This was a crime." Yes, said Uncle Orlando with a smirk. Their responsibility. Then it is over? Said Naphtali. The murders of innocent people will continue? Everyone will act as if nothing happened? Uncle Orlando stood a little taller. Naphtali, there is always something that can be done. For now, I will submit on the outside, but on the inside, they can never make me surrender my true feelings. I will wait, and then I will start again. But how? Where? There are editors who will hire me. If not for a newspaper here, then somewhere else. I'll start by writing more stories. Stories that might make people whisper behind closed doors. Did you know that many whispers can make a very loud noise? Look around. What do you see? Naphtali looked at his uncle in disbelief. What was there to see? Everything his uncle had built was now gone. Why was he not fighting mad? Naphtali threw up his arms. Nothing! I see nothing! The walls are gone! The machines are destroyed! There is nothing left except one empty drawer! They have won! Uncle Orlando held up his hand to stop Naphtali's ranting. He walked to a mound of smoking ash and kicked it with his boot. Underneath, glowing embers pulsed like a heart. You are wrong. Just like Mount Yaima, there is always something burning beneath the surface. Sometimes it takes years to erupt, but eventually it will. Nephew, they may have silenced La Mañana, but they will never silence my pen. He extended his outstretched hand to Naphtali. Naphtali looked into his uncle's determined face. He did not see a man defeated by exhaustion. He saw a man ready to fight another day. He did not see a man covered head to toe in soot. He saw a man covered in righteousness. He did not see a man's red and blurry eyes. He saw an intense resolve to speak for those who could not speak for themselves. Naphtali reached out and gripped his uncle's palm and held it tight. Nor will they silence mine. Is fire born of words, or are words born of fire? Blip, 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 blop. Whip, 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 whip. Bloop, bloop, bloop. Blip, blip, blop. Blip, 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 blop. Bloop, bloop, bloop. Blip, blip, blop. Whip, whip, whip. Din, 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 din. Din, 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 din.